The day the Vralek ships entered human space, the sky above the colony of Helios Prime turned dark. People ran into shelters, alarms wailed across cities, and every defense system came online. The Vralek were not just another alien race. They were the galaxy's most feared predators. Stories of their wars had traveled through generations, how they fought with claws and fire, how no world had ever survived their wrath. But as their massive ships descended through the clouds, no weapons fired. No armies followed. Instead, the Vralek broadcasted a single message across every human frequency, a deep, trembling voice that said, "We seek peace. We seek safety." No one believed it. The Federation's military prepared for war, certain it was a trap. Yet amid all the confusion and fear, one woman stepped forward. Commander Elise Tran, the officer in charge of the Helios Defense Council. She was known for her calm under pressure and her ability to see reason where others saw only threat. When others demanded the aliens be destroyed, she quietly said, "We listen first." As their ship landed on the outskirts of the colony, the ground shook like thunder. The air was thick with tension as soldiers surrounded the landing site, weapons raised. The Vralek appeared moments later, towering, armored, their skin a mix of silver and black, their eyes burning with faint light. Even standing still, they looked dangerous, their bodies built for survival and power. Every human instinct screamed to run or fight, but Elise didn't move. She stepped forward slowly, her voice steady. "You came here asking for peace," she said. "Then start by showing us you mean it." The largest of the Vralek, their leader, lowered his weapon and knelt on one knee, a gesture none of them had ever seen before. "We mean it," he growled softly. "Our home is gone. We have no war left to fight." The soldiers around her exchanged uneasy glances. To them it was unthinkable, predators asking for mercy. But Elise saw something in their leader's expression that silenced her doubts. It wasn't dominance or rage, it was exhaustion, the kind that comes after losing everything. She lowered her weapon, slowly motioning for her troops to stand down. "Then we talk," she said firmly. "No weapons, no threats, just truth." For the first time in known history, humans and Vralek stood face to face, not as enemies, but as survivors of different kinds. That night, the colony's broadcast channels were flooded with debates. Some called Elise a fool, saying she'd doomed them all. Others said she'd done something humanity had never dared. She had trusted those the galaxy feared most. Inside the landing bay, the Vralek remained quiet, watching the humans from a distance, their movements slow and cautious. Elise stayed there long after everyone else left, studying them through the observation glass. She didn't see monsters. She saw a species trying to survive, just like humans had done countless times before. When the lights dimmed and silence filled the air, she whispered to herself, "Maybe fear isn't always the enemy?" Outside, the stars shimmered faintly over the ships of both species, a fragile beginning between two worlds that had only ever known each other through stories of war. And though no one knew what would happen next, one thing was certain: this meeting would change the galaxy forever. The meeting was set inside the largest hangar of Helios Prime's military base, a wide, cold space filled with the hum of tension. Rows of soldiers stood shoulder to shoulder, their rifles locked and ready. The air was heavy with the sound of armored boots and the faint growl of the Vralek delegation that had arrived. The predators stood tall, their scales reflecting the harsh white lights, their eyes sharp and watchful. Every movement they made caused a ripple of unease through the human ranks. They were terrifying to look at. Every instinct screamed that these creatures were built for killing. Yet they made no move to attack. They just stood there, breathing heavily, scanning the room, as if trying to understand the fear that surrounded them. Commander Elise Tran walked in slowly, her steps echoing against the metal floor. She wore no armor, no weapon, only her officer's uniform and a quiet expression that seemed out of place in such a charged moment. Her second-in-command whispered urgently, "Ma'am, this is a mistake! They could tear us apart before we blink." Elise didn't answer. She could feel the fear pressing against her from all sides, from her soldiers, from the alien guests, from the very walls that had seen too many battles. But she also knew fear had a voice and it needed to be answered with reason. She stopped midway between the two groups, raising her hand gently. "Stand down," she said softly to her soldiers. A murmur of protest rippled through the line, but her tone left no room for argument. The rifles lowered a few inches, enough to show hesitation but not surrender. Across the room, the Vralek leader, massive and scarred, let out a low hiss that made several humans flinch. Elise didn't move. She met his gaze directly, her heartbeat steady. "We can't call ourselves civilized," she said, her voice carrying clearly, "if we meet fear with fear." The silence that followed was suffocating. The human guards looked uncertain, some exchanging nervous glances. The Vralek shifted uneasily, their claws tapping against the floor, their instincts still on edge. The leader tilted his head, his alien features unreadable. "You do not fear us?" he asked, his voice rough like stone scraping metal. Elise's eyes softened. "I do," she admitted. "But fear doesn't mean hate. It just means we have something to learn about each other." Behind her, one of the soldiers whispered, "She's insane!" Another muttered, "They killed hundreds during the border wars." But Elise ignored them. She took a single step closer to the Vralek leader. He tensed, his muscles tightening, but she didn't stop. "You came here asking for peace," she continued, her tone steady and firm. "Then show us you mean it." The Vralek leader stared at her for what felt like an eternity. Then slowly he lowered the weapon strapped to his back and knelt, one knee against the ground, head bowed slightly. The sound of his armor against the floor echoed through the hangar, startling everyone. His soldiers followed his lead, bowing their heads too. "We mean it," he said finally, his deep voice softer now. "Our war is over. We are tired." For the first time, Elise saw it clearly. Not hatred, not rage, but exhaustion carved into their every movement. These were not monsters looking for conquest. They were refugees seeking mercy. She turned to her soldiers, her expression unreadable but calm. "Lower your weapons," she said quietly. This time, no one argued. As the rifles dropped fully, the atmosphere shifted. The room no longer felt like a battlefield. It felt like a fragile beginning. Elise exhaled slowly, realizing she had just taken the most dangerous step of her career, choosing trust in the face of fear. And yet, as the Vralek leader looked up at her with weary eyes, she felt certain she had done the right thing. In the days that followed the first meeting, the uneasy peace between humans and Vralek began to take shape. Negotiations were slow, tense, and filled with suspicion on both sides. Every word spoken was measured, every gesture carefully studied. But amid the guarded talks and political caution, there was one unusual presence that caught everyone's attention. A young Vralek who refused to stay with his group. He was smaller than the others, his armor dull and scratched, his eyes brighter, curious rather than cold. His name was Korr. Unlike the other Vralek warriors who spoke little and trusted less, Korr seemed drawn to the human commander, Elise. Wherever she went, whether to the control room, the mess hall, or the negotiation chamber, he followed, silent and alert, watching her with the careful intensity of a guardian. At first the crew was uncomfortable. Some whispered that he was spying. Others thought he was waiting for the right moment to attack. But Elise didn't push him away. She saw something familiar in the way he stood apart from his own kind, a quiet curiosity that mirrored her own. One afternoon, as she reviewed the base's reactor readings, she noticed Korr standing at the doorway, studying the screens. "You don't have to follow me everywhere," she said lightly, without looking up. Korr tilted his head, not fully understanding. "Protect," he said simply, his voice deep but unsure. Elise smiled faintly. "From what?" she asked. Korr hesitated before replying. "From your people." The words caught her off guard. She realized then that trust went both ways. He didn't just want her protection. He wanted to give his. That fragile bond was tested sooner than anyone expected. Late one evening, alarms blared across the base, a reactor malfunction. Red lights flashed through the corridors and engineers scrambled as the energy core began to overheat. One wrong move and the entire outpost would explode. Without waiting for orders, Elise grabbed her toolkit and ran toward the reactor chamber. The soldiers shouted after her, but she didn't stop. She had always believed that leadership meant standing on the front line when it mattered. When she reached the chamber, heat waves distorted the air. Steam hissed from broken pipes and sparks rained down from above. Elise climbed through the wreckage, trying to reach the damaged coolant valve. Suddenly, the sound of metal tearing echoed behind her. Part of the ceiling gave way. Before she could move, something massive lunged forward. Korr. He tackled her to the ground, his armored body taking the full impact of the falling debris. The crash shook the floor and dust filled the room. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Korr lifted the wreckage off his shoulder with a groan and looked at her. His armor was cracked, his claws blackened with heat, but he didn't flinch. "Stay back," he growled softly, shielding her as another pipe burst nearby. Elise ignored the fear clawing at her chest and crawled toward the valve, her hands shaking as she worked to stabilize the reactor. It took nearly 5 minutes, 5 long, blistering minutes, before the warning lights turned from red to blue. The base fell quiet again. Breathing heavily, she turned to Korr, who sat slumped against the wall, his breathing ragged but steady. "You saved me," she said, her voice breaking with relief. He looked at her, his alien features softened by exhaustion, and replied in slow, broken English, "No, you showed me how." In that moment, Elise understood the truth. He hadn't acted out of instinct or duty. He had made a choice, one that went against everything his species was known for, and from that day forward, Korr never left her side again. To the others, he was still a predator. But to Elise, he was proof that even the most feared creatures could learn compassion, and that kindness, once shown, could rewrite the nature of an entire species. The alliance between humans and the Vralek was fragile, like glass under pressure. At first, the story of the predator who protected a human spread across the colony like wildfire. Some saw it as a miracle, proof that even the fiercest species could change. But others saw it as a threat. Soldiers whispered behind Elise's back, saying she had been fooled, that Korr was only pretending to be loyal until his people could strike again. The Federation Council began sending messages filled with warnings and orders, demanding she return the alien for safety evaluation. Elise ignored them all. "He's not a weapon," she said in one meeting. "He's proof that even those born to fight can learn peace." Her words carried conviction, but inside, she wasn't as sure as she sounded. Not because she doubted Korr, but because she doubted humanity's ability to let go of fear. The tension grew day by day. Whenever Korr entered a room, the chatter stopped. People stared. Some flinched. Others gripped their sidearms tighter. He felt it too. The way humans avoided him, the way their eyes followed him like he was a ticking bomb. Sometimes he stayed in the ship's engine room, away from everyone. Elise would find him there, sitting in silence, his claws folded against the cold floor. "They hate me," he said once, his voice low and uncertain. Elise shook her head. "They're afraid," she replied, "and fear makes people blind." One night, the fear reached its breaking point. A group of security officers cornered Elise in her quarters. "Commander," one of them said sharply, "you're putting everyone at risk. That thing—" He stopped mid-sentence when Elise's expression hardened. "That thing saved my life," she interrupted, "and I trust him more than anyone who hides behind fear." The officers exchanged glances, unsure whether to argue or obey. "With all due respect," another said, "trusting a predator is not protocol." Elise stepped closer, her voice quiet but firm. "Then maybe it's time we rewrite the protocol." They left without another word, but she knew she had just made enemies within her own ranks. Later that evening, Elise found Korr standing on the observation deck, looking out at the stars. His reflection shimmered against the glass, a towering figure built for war, now standing motionless in peace. "You should rest," she said softly. He didn't turn. "Your people will fight you for me," he said, not as a question but as a fact. Elise smiled faintly. "Maybe," she admitted. "But I've faced worse odds." Korr tilted his head, his golden eyes catching the starlight. Why? He asked. Why risk your life for me? She paused before answering. Because someone has to show the galaxy that fear doesn't always have to win. Those words lingered in the air long after she left. Korr stood there for hours thinking. No human had ever spoken to his kind that way, not with pity, not with fear, but with hope. He understood now that Elise's fight wasn't just for him. It was for everyone, human and alien alike, who had ever been judged by what they were instead of who they could become. As the days passed, the division within the base grew sharper. Some soldiers began quietly supporting Elise, calling her brave. Others whispered that she had lost her mind. But through it all, she never wavered. Even when doubt crept in during sleepless nights, she reminded herself of Korr's words in the reactor room. You showed me how. Maybe she couldn't change the galaxy overnight, but if one predator could learn compassion, then maybe, just maybe, humanity could too. The night of the attack began like any other, quiet, calm, and routine. The stars outside shimmered against the black of space, and inside the base, the hum of machinery filled the silence. Elise was in the command room, reviewing reports about the upcoming peace meeting. Korr stood nearby, keeping watch as he always did. Then, without warning, the lights flickered. The ground trembled. The first explosion hit the south wing, sending a shock wave through the station. Sirens blared, red lights flashing across the corridors. The radio came alive with shouts. We're under attack! Unknown hostiles breaching the outer gates! Before Elise could respond, another explosion ripped through the ceiling above them. Metal and debris came crashing down. She barely had time to dive aside before part of a support beam collapsed, trapping her leg beneath it. Pain shot through her body, sharp and burning. Smoke filled the air, and she could hear screams echoing down the hallway. Her radio hissed with static. Command, come in. Multiple hostiles! Then silence. She tried to move, but the beam was too heavy. Panic clawed at her chest as fire spread nearby, filling the air with heat and ash. She coughed, pressing her hand to the floor, trying to drag herself free. Then footsteps, heavy, fast, pounding against the metal floor. For a moment, fear took over. She thought the mercenaries had found her. But then, through the haze, she saw a tall, familiar silhouette emerge from the smoke. Korr, she whispered. The Vralek's golden eyes cut through the dust as he rushed forward, his movements sharp and powerful. Without a word, he tore the wreckage away with a strength that no human could match. The metal screeched, bending under his claws. Elise gasped as her leg came free. Korr knelt beside her, scanning her for injuries. You hurt, he said, his deep voice filled with worry. She managed a faint smile. Just a little, she breathed. Before they could move, gunfire erupted from the corridor ahead. The mercenaries had arrived, human extremists who opposed the peace treaty. They saw Korr instantly and shouted, "Target the alien!" Bullets tore through the air, sparks flying as they hit the walls. Without hesitation, Korr turned, placing himself between Elise and the attackers. He roared, not in rage, but in defiance, and his armored body absorbed the hits one after another. The sound of bullets striking his scales echoed like thunder. Elise screamed, "Korr, stop! You'll be killed!" But he didn't move. He stood tall, spreading his arms to shield her completely. The soldiers kept firing, shouting insults about monsters and traitors. But Korr didn't fight back. He didn't strike them, even though he easily could have. His only focus was keeping her alive. Every impact made him stumble. Every wound bled dark across his chest. But he held firm. Through the noise and chaos, Elise heard him speak. Low, broken, but clear. "Protect, friend." Something inside her broke at those words. The creature everyone had feared, the so-called predator, was willing to die not for war, not for glory, but for friendship. She crawled forward, reaching for his arm. "We're getting out of here," she said, her voice trembling but determined. With great effort, Korr lifted her into his arms and carried her through the smoke-filled corridor. The base burned around them, alarms howling like dying stars. When they finally reached the evac bay, Korr collapsed to one knee, still clutching her. Soldiers rushed in, shouting orders, trying to stop the bleeding. Elise held on to him, whispering, "You saved me again." His eyes flickered weakly, his breathing shallow. No, he said slowly, the words heavy and rough. We save each other. And as medics pulled them both into the shuttle, Elise realized something she would never forget. The night humanity and the Vralek truly stopped being enemies wasn't written in treaties or speeches. It was written in the moment one predator chose compassion over violence and called a human his friend. The long night finally ended. The fires had died down, the alarms had gone silent, and the stars outside glowed faintly against the black sky. The base that had once echoed with chaos now sat in uneasy stillness. The mercenaries who had come to destroy everything were gone, not because they had been overpowered, but because they had faced something they couldn't understand. Humans and Vralek had stood together. They had fought not as enemies, but as allies, and in doing so, they had shattered centuries of fear. When Elise finally opened her eyes, the soft hum of medical machines filled the infirmary. Her vision blurred for a moment before focusing on the ceiling lights. She tried to move, but felt a sharp ache in her leg, reminding her of the battle. As she turned her head, she saw him, Korr, lying on the medical bed beside hers. His chest was wrapped in thick bandages, his breathing steady but slow. For a brief second, panic surged through her. "Korr," she whispered. The medic standing nearby smiled gently. "He's alive, Commander." "You both are." "You should thank him. He carried you halfway across the base." Relief washed over her. She tried to sit up, wincing slightly. Around the room, other crew members were being treated, both humans and Vralek side by side. The sight made her heart tighten. Just a few days ago, these same soldiers wouldn't have dared to stand near a Vralek, let alone fight shoulder to shoulder with one. Now, one human was helping a wounded Vralek drink water, another was wrapping bandages around an alien arm. The barriers built from fear and rumor had begun to crumble. Across the room, Captain Heller, one of the men who had once demanded that Korr be locked up, stood at the door, watching in silence. When he noticed Elise awake, he approached. His uniform was torn, his face streaked with ash and exhaustion. "You were right," he said quietly. "He's not a weapon." He looked toward Korr, who was still unconscious, then back at her. "He's something else entirely." Elise smiled faintly. "He's proof that trust is stronger than fear." The captain nodded. "You know, when the mercenaries hit the south gate, we were surrounded. One of the Vralek, not your friend, another, pushed one of my men out of the blast zone, saved his life." He exhaled slowly, almost in disbelief. "I've seen humans hesitate to do that." Elise looked around the room again. The difference was almost invisible, yet deeply felt. No speeches had been made, no orders given, but something fundamental had changed. The way people looked at each other, the way they moved, the way they spoke, there was no longer hostility, only quiet respect. A low growl broke the silence. Elise turned and saw Korr stirring, his eyes opening slightly. He blinked, confused, then relaxed when he saw her awake. "Still alive," he muttered weakly. She smiled. "You too," she whispered back. For a moment, they said nothing else. They didn't need to. The silence between them was full of understanding, the kind that only exists between those who have fought, bled, and survived together. Later that morning, when word spread that both Elise and Korr had survived, the crew gathered outside the infirmary. No one called Korr a predator anymore. No one looked at him with fear. Instead, they stood in silent respect. Some even nodded to him when he looked their way. It was small, but it was everything. As the artificial sun rose over the colony, Elise looked out the window and whispered to herself, "Maybe peace doesn't start with treaties or politics. Maybe it starts right here, with one act of trust that refuses to die." And as Korr drifted back to sleep beside her, the hum of the base returned, steady, calm, alive again, carrying with it the quiet promise of a new beginning. Days after the battle, the galaxy was buzzing. News of the event on the human base had spread faster than light. Every transmission, every report spoke about the same thing, a predator alien who had risked his life to save a human. To some, it sounded like propaganda. To others, it sounded like hope. For the first time in generations, humans and Vralek were mentioned in the same sentence, not as enemies, but as allies. The Galactic Council, made up of dozens of species, called for an emergency session to discuss what had happened. And at the center of that meeting stood Commander Elise Tran. She stood on a raised platform inside the great council chamber, a vast room filled with light and whispers. Delegates from across the stars, reptilian, avian, mechanical, and human, filled the seats around her. Behind her, projected on a towering screen, was the image of Korr, standing tall but calm, his golden eyes reflecting the light. It was a powerful image. The predator everyone had once feared, now standing beside a human who called him a friend. The hall was silent as Elise stepped up to the podium. She took a deep breath, looked across the crowd, and began to speak. "For centuries," she said softly, "we've told stories about monsters, creatures so different from us that we believed they could never feel, never care, never change." Her voice was calm but carried across the chamber with strength. "We called the Vralek beasts. We called them killers, but I stood beside one when my base was attacked. And I watched him protect not only me, but the people who once pointed guns at him." She paused, letting her words sink in. No one moved. No one spoke. "Monsters don't risk their lives to save others," she continued. "They don't bleed for peace." "Maybe," she said, her eyes scanning the rows of alien faces. "The real monsters are the walls we build in our minds." A quiet murmur spread through the chamber. The words hit harder than any argument or report. Elise didn't raise her voice or shout. She didn't need to. Her calmness carried more power than anger ever could. "We think strength means domination," she said. "We think peace means silence. But maybe true strength is the courage to trust. Maybe peace starts when we stop deciding who deserves it." The camera drones floating above captured every moment, broadcasting her speech across thousands of star systems. People watched from colonies, from ships, from distant planets that had never cared about humans before. Some wept. Others simply sat in silence, realizing that history was changing right in front of them. Behind her, Korr stood still, his hands clasped in front of him. He understood only part of her words, but he could feel their meaning. He felt it in the way people looked at him, not as a threat, but as a living being. And when Elise turned slightly to look at him, he nodded once, a small, silent gesture of mutual respect. When her speech ended, there was no applause at first, just a heavy, thoughtful silence. Then slowly, one delegate stood and began to clap. Another joined, and another. Within seconds, the entire chamber echoed with applause, not just for Elise, but for what her words represented. Across the galaxy, people began to talk, really talking about unity, compassion, and what it truly meant to be civilized. As she stepped away from the podium, Elise glanced at Korr. "You ready for what comes next?" she asked quietly. He tilted his head. "Next?" he repeated. She smiled faintly. "Change," she said. "The kind that starts small but grows." Outside, as the council's communication beacons lit up, spreading her words across the stars, the galaxy began to shift, not through weapons, not through conquest, but through the simple truth that one act of kindness could rewrite the fate of worlds. Many years passed since that day when Elise and Korr stood together before the Galactic Council. The scars of war that once stretched across countless worlds had slowly begun to fade. What had started as a fragile hope had grown into something powerful. Real peace. Planets that had once feared each other now traded, learned, and even built together. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. And for the first time in history, humanity and the Vralek shared that progress as equals. Children born in that new era didn't understand why their parents once called the Vralek monsters. To them, the tall, scaled beings with glowing golden eyes weren't predators. They were friends, neighbors, sometimes even mentors. In classrooms, young humans and Vralek sat side by side, learning about each other's cultures and histories. They laughed together, played together, and when they looked at old pictures from the wars, they asked the same question: why did everyone fight for so long? On Earth, in the heart of the Federation Hall, a monument stood tall, a symbol of the change that began with one act of compassion. It wasn't a grand, heroic statue of soldiers or leaders. Instead, it showed something simple and powerful. A human woman standing beside a Vralek warrior, both looking toward the stars. The inscription below read, "Fear divided us. Compassion made us family." Visitors from every world came to see it, often leaving small offerings, a flower, a data chip, a carved stone, tokens of gratitude to the ones who reminded the galaxy what peace could look like. Korr, the once feared predator, had lived to see that peace himself. He never called himself a hero. He lived quietly, working as an ambassador between his people and the humans. He would visit schools and tell the children stories about his first days among humans, about how strange and loud they were, how they smiled too much, but how their hearts were stronger than any weapon he had ever known. And whenever someone asked him what changed everything, he would answer simply, "A human saw me, not as an enemy, but as someone worth saving." Elise, too, lived to see the galaxy heal. Though her hair had turned gray and her uniform had long been replaced with civilian clothes, she still carried the same calm strength she had all those years ago. When she visited the monument, she would often stand quietly in front of it, watching the sunlight reflect off the metal figures. Sometimes she would see children, human and Vralek, running around the base of the statue, laughing. Those moments made her eyes glisten with tears of joy. She didn't need to be remembered as a commander or a negotiator. She was simply part of a story where kindness had won. Across the stars, other species began to follow the same example. Former enemies began opening talks, learning from the humans and the Vralek. The galaxy had realized something that no war had ever managed to teach. Peace wasn't created through victory. It was created through understanding. Generations later, historians would call that era the Great Healing. They would say it started the day a predator chose to protect a human. They would tell their students about how fear had ruled the stars for millennia, but compassion had broken that cycle. And whenever those young minds looked at the monument, a human and a predator standing together under the same light, they would understand the truth of those words carved beneath. Fear divided us. Compassion made us family. And so, the galaxy never forgot. Because in the end, it wasn't weapons or power that changed the universe. It was a single moment of trust between two beings who had every reason to hate each other, yet chose love instead.